Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. And in this video, I'll be talking about my thoughts on the latest season of the challenge, All Stars Season 3, which coming into this season, I was extremely hyped for. Thinking that this season had one of the best casts in the history of the show. And with this feeling like the culmination of All Stars up to this point, I had really high expectations for this season. And I do think that definitely played into why I end up being kind of underwhelmed with this season. Not that it's bad, it's still good on par with the previous All-Star seasons, but with the expectation that I had coming into it, I did find the level of quality here to be lower than I was expecting. Though, through this season, I do feel like we get the return of some notable figures, and we do get the start of some notable rivalries, and we do get some interesting drama along the way that does still keep this as a solid season in my eyes. But the run through why, we'll be running through season from beginning to end. So let's start off with the premiere, where we do find out that this is a cast of players who have all qualified for a final, even though that's not true, as Naya never did, being DQ'd before the final elimination that was supposed to determine whether or not she was going to make the finals. Look, it's technically not true. And even beyond that, some of the players that did make a final were on seasons that didn't have eliminations, which to me shouldn't count either. So, again, obviously this is just a tagline that you're trying to use to prop up the cast, but I did find it humorous whenever they said it. But I will say again, I do love this cast. I mean, in terms of legacy, this is one of the most iconic casts of all time, with the male field in particular having many of the proclaimed best challengers of all time, while the women field, while not as elite, does still have some really interesting returnees from the likes of Veronica and Naya, and we do get some strong competitors, and Kellyanne, Kendall, and John A, and also Kayla. Though the appearance of Kayla and Sylvia on this season was a very questionable choice to me, with them being such recent additions to the challenge universe, having their first seasons only 5 years ago, and Kayla just being on not even 2 years ago. So I did feel like this took away from the initial concept of what All Stars was supposed to be, but it did still add to the competitiveness of this season. But we do get a bit of a strange introduction here, with players joining the villa sporadically throughout the intro, though first we do end up seeing Veronica and Tina being reunited as the first to enter, which was cool to see them back together for the first time since Inferno 2, and they do have a fun dynamic here. But again, after that, it's a long montage of players entering, and I did find it funny that Sylvia gets a confessional saying that she doesn't know why she's there, and again, me too. But along the way, we do get some fun character moments, from Tina getting her heel stuck, to Mark not taking the tags off the bottom of his shoes. We have Kayla almost walking into the pool. We get Wes talking about taking the fun out of All Stars and ruining it, and with this and following confessionals from others talking about how they don't like Wes, and him also getting this winner quote of him planning to win and wanting to make everyone squirm, it did lead to a really interesting arc for Wes on this season. Tyler also gets a lot of focus here as well, with him outlining his strategy of playing it cool, and says, "How could you not lose?" which very much felt like blatant setup for him being the first boot here. We do also get the return of Jordan and Naya. They've always had this very complex relationship, but they end up coming in here as a couple, which, while the casting of the two of them here was a bit of a controversial one, I did like seeing them be able to redeem themselves here, to which they both end up having a solid run. But then we get to the first daily, which was kind of lame, of it being a memorization comp, and considering the strong field that we did get here, I did find the dailies as a whole to be underwhelming on this season, with them keeping up this toned down nature. But we do get a decent format to start here, in that the last place finisher automatically goes into elimination, while the top 3 of each sex form the authority and get to pick the other person to go in, which is fine. I mean, nothing really new here, though I don't love the deciding group ends up being that big, with it being 6 people, which seems a bit much. But we do get an additional reward for the challenge winners, in that they get to sabotage a player at the next daily, which again is fine. It does add more of a social strategy element to the game here, with it causing some feuds moving forward. So again, mostly a positive there. As for daily, the men's side of things leads to a lot of content from Cyrus, talking about being in the best shape of his life, though humorously he does end up losing this first challenge, though obviously he does get redeemed by the end of the episode by winning the elimination. But also here we do see Wes and Yes coming in first and second, which kind of starts their rivalry, which ends up being an interesting plot thread throughout the first half of this season, though one that did feel very manufactured, especially from Wes's end. On the women's side of things, we do see Cynthia lose the challenge, who, despite getting the most confessionals in this first episode, I didn't feel like I got to know much about her. But we do also see Veronica worrying for Tina here, as Tina ends up being second to last, and Tina talks about feeling safe with Veronica in there, which should tell you clearly what's going to happen here, where the authority decide to play fair and pick the second to last players in the daily in Tina and Tyler to go into elimination. Though we do get some talk about targeting Jordan along the way, with Jordan seeming like the clear frontrunner coming into the season, though obviously it felt like the cast knew that as well. That did make him a big target. But Wes gets a lot of credit here for not targeting Jordan and starting a sentiment of the bottom players going in, which will help the physical players get through, which is interesting strategy, but also like would lead to boring TV, which feels very un-Wes-like, but then again, it doesn't even go through anyway. But then we get to the arena, where the elimination plays out as expected, with Cyrus's arc coming through, leading to a sad farewell for Tyler, who just simply isn't in the shape that he used to be back in his prime. And as for the women, we do end up seeing Cynthia getting similar content to that of Leia from last season, though again, I just did not find this moment as impactful. But after the limbs here, we do learn about the stars, which felt like a dumbed down version of skulls that are supposed to be like this benefit for winning eliminations. Though I do feel like for a lot of the season, they end up being largely forgettable. Well, let's talk about the two boots here. First, we do have Cynthia, who again was fine. I mean, she was likable, and it was cool to see someone from Road Rules All-Stars back for All-Stars here, but really she didn't have much to do, where it really felt like her storyline was one that we had seen before, and she just didn't seem to click with the rest of the cast, didn't seem to be willing to play the more strategic elements of the game, to where she just seemed like a very easy first boot. And then we have Tyler, who again, I feel for, after having two pretty bad all-star appearances now, with this one in particular having the sting, especially losing to Cyrus, who isn't noted to be one of the greatest competitors in the world, probably the weakest on this cast on paper. So again, Tyler ends up having an underwhelming run here. And also as a character, again, it felt like we got a lot of the same content that we got from season 2, with him coming off as the life of the party, and we do get a lot of content in this episode about how much people like him, but it just seems like he isn't the competitor that he used to be. Now for episode 2, which in typical challenge fashion starts with Tina talking about thinking that she's going to be left alone now that she's won an elimination, and also mentions that Melinda is one of her closest allies. So I wonder what's going to happen here. But also we do hear about Melinda's ankle injury that stems from the final of All Stars 2, which I should mention that this season was filmed only a few months after season 2, which seemed to have a major impact on many of the players from that season, with many of them still being injured and those injuries playing a factor here. Which also seems irresponsible of production to even let them on the season, but again, that's challenge production for you. Also here we get Mark and Latarian getting their own share of personal content, with Latarian being shown in the same mold as Tyler in the last episode, which made it clear that he was kind of on his way out. But also we do get the start of the Sylvia, Kayla versus Kellyanne and Kendall storyline, with Sylvia using her sabotage against Kellyanne, though despite that, Kellyanne still ends up being one of the few to reach the puzzle stage, though there she humorously struggles with it, which ends up being a recurring theme across the season. But Wes ends up saboing Jordan, which is completely ineffective, as Jordan wins his heat anyway, and Wes almost comes in last, only beating Latarian in the puzzle. While on the women's side of things, Tina ends up DQing and going in that way, which leads to a humorous combo between her and TJ, where he tells her no one has shit the bed that much, and we do see her being asked about who she wants to go in, to which she says anybody but Veronica and Melinda, which we end up seeing the authority being really upset that she made demands, which is dumb considering they literally asked her who she wanted to go in against. But obviously they end up putting her in against Melinda. While on the guys' side of things, it was a bit more interesting, where the obvious pick would have been to put in Wes, especially with Yes and Jordan in the authority, though he ends up being saved by a weird deliberation process of each of the authority getting to save one player, and Brad ends up saving Wes, which results in Mark getting put in really early here, which is a pretty shocking result to see him on the bottom so early here, especially considering his reputation of being this great political player. But he ends up going in against Latarian, a rematch from season 1, which ends up being the same here, with Mark taking him out, giving Latarian his earliest defeat, while the women's elimination doesn't even happen due to Melinda having to drop out due to her injury, and considering she couldn't even walk and Nehemiah had to walk her out, I do feel like this really shows you how negligent production was in putting her on the cast here. But with that, let's talk about the boots here, starting with Melinda, who again was there. She wasn't that prevalent on the show, had a really quiet premiere, and her content in this episode mostly revolved around her relationship with Wes and Tina, and her injury, so again, she didn't get that much to do here. But then we get Laterian, who, I do feel for, where he does seem to be a solid challenger, but keeps on getting a raw deal on these All-Star seasons, with having mediocre partners in the last 2 seasons, and him ending up being in a pretty physical elimination against Mark here. So while Laterian isn't the most riveting TV, I do feel like he still has a glimmer of potential to at least make the final at some point, so I wouldn't be opposed to seeing him again personally. But now for episode 3, which further establishes some relationships, with Veronica talking about being close to Tina and Jemmye, once again being blatant foreshadowing to the later eliminations. But also here we do get the establishment of the treehouse, this majority alliance on the women's side of things that for some reason includes Derek. But this really does leave Kendall and Kellyanne on the outs here as the massive targets on the other side. Plus, also, we do get more of the Yes-Wes rivalry, with them getting a really awkward conversation that leads to Yes saboing Wes in the daily, while Kendall ends up making a really questionable decision with hers. And really, this is what you should expect from Kendall at this point, with her playing the game in this very indecisive way that left her on the outs of the original All-Stars season. But here she ends up asking if she can use it on a guy, to which Jordan offers himself up. Yet for some reason she doesn't just take that offer. She at one point even asks if she can use it on herself, which, why? But she ends up putting the sabo on MJ, which ends up pissing Janae off, while also just showing the rest of the cast how chaotic Kendall is. That makes it really difficult for people to trust her. The daily here was one that I actually ended up enjoying, with it being a pretty physical one, but one that did test social dynamics with players being able to help each other out. And while this isn't ideal for a daily that doles out power, with this favoring the majority, I still found it fun to watch, though it does lead to multiple injuries. On the women's side of it, we do see Veronica holding Kendall down with the intention of putting Kendall in elimination, though Kendall's able to escape anyway, making this backfire on the treehouse, with Veronica now heading into elimination herself. We also end up seeing Tina hold back Kellyanne, which does lead to the treehouse having the majority in the authority, but also ends up causing Tina to injure her finger, which she ends up getting DQ'd for later. So while the treehouse was able to win the challenge due to their numbers, it certainly didn't play exactly into their favor. As for the men, we do end up seeing another of these injuries from All-Stars 2 playing a factor here, where MJ still has a banged up knee and further ends up injuring it, and through that comes in last. Also, we see a spat between Nehemiah and Yes, with Yes targeting him due to his association with Wes, but Brad ends up winning the comp here instead, winning every single round, which starts a pretty strong daily run for him across the season. Now again, for the women, Kendall ends up being an easy target, but on the men's side, it is pretty interesting once again, with Wes doing a lot of campaigning against Yes, and it seemed to almost go through, with him convincing Jordan to agree to it, and we do see Mark even approaching MJ with this plan, but it did seem to shut out from there, with MJ wanting to go against Cyrus instead as an easy person to beat, despite how much content we get about Cyrus being in the best shape of his life. But right before the elimination, we do get a surprise scene here of Jemmye getting a call from her mom, being informed that something happened to her dad, leading to her having to quit the game, which really comes out of nowhere, though once again plays into this worst day ever storyline for Veronica here, with her now having lost her 2 closest allies. And also going to the elimination, though as you can expect, the women's elimination ends up being cancelled, but we do see the MJ versus Cyrus one, which does mostly play out with MJ being way ahead, though Cyrus does start to pick up some pace towards the end, but still ends up losing there, which ends up being kind of an underwhelming ending to Cyrus's run. But with that, let's talk about the boots, the first of which was Tina, who I've always loved as a character, and she provides mostly the same content here, though again she abruptly gets taken out, which ends up being largely underwhelming, though again her getting this kind of humorous comeuppance for sacrificing herself to stop Kellyanne from winning the daily, which ends up DQing her, ends up being kind of like a funny little storyline of how she gets taken out here, but still would have preferred her to make a deeper run here. Then we have Jemmye, who I've always liked as a confessionalist, and she does also end up getting more of the same content here, though again does get under-edited, mostly because she doesn't end up being that important to the storyline, though obviously I do feel bad for her with her having to leave due to her father's illness, which is a terrible way to go, but obviously completely understandable. And finally, we do have Cyrus, who again, I do find most of his storyline across the season to be really humorous about how it's showing him as being in the best shape of his life, and while he does win that one elimination, you can tell that despite all this improvement, he's still one of the worst competitors on this cast, being really outclassed by what is one of the best male casts in the history of the show. But realistically, I really just don't see Cyrus being someone that will ever make that deep of a run on the challenge, but is still a mostly likable figure despite that. Now let's jump into episode 4, which right off the bat we do get some content focusing on Jordan and Naya, with the two of them being really quiet in the edit up until this point, with Naya in particular being near invisible, but this spike in visibility did make it pretty clear that at least one of the two were heading into elimination. But then we do get to the daily, where we do get a replacement being called in for Jemmy, and that person being Beth, who I was happy to see back here to add to the legacy of this cast. Obviously, it would have been great to see her and Tina together, though supposedly there's reasons why they weren't, but I was happy to see her here, even though I didn't feel like she was as entertaining as she used to be on All Stars 1, though she does end up bringing a lot of the drama here with her rivalry with Veronica immediately after being reunited, and we do get this humorous double confessional with them where they end up arguing by the end of it, and that's really fun content. Now the daily itself ends up being another kind of lame one, but one that did again have an interesting social strategy element to it, where the players had to group up in threes, only for it to be revealed that they're actually competitors, not in teams, and the daily ends up being a simple math equation that they have to do while standing on a ledge high in the air, but the first to finish the equation ends up having to pick which of the two losers becomes the official loser of the round, meaning that they will be in contention for going straight into elimination, which again favors the majority, and again is a lame challenge for the challenge, but I did find it mostly entertaining, even though both sides do end up having an easy loser, with both having someone quit. For the men, it was Darrell, who had talked numerous times about his increased fear of heights, but also humorously for the women, we do end up seeing Beth, who had literally just come in, end up quitting here, and we do have TJ scolding her for coming in just to be taken back out, so I did find that to be an interesting development here. But here we do see Brad using his Sabo on MJ, which ends up starting their rivalry, and also continues the streak of MJ getting Saboed, which ends up happening every daily until his eventual boot, though he is actually able to overcome it in this daily with him beating Jordan despite his 1-minute penalty. Now we also see Kayla Saboing Kendall, despite the fact that Kellyanne was in her heat, which I thought was a very questionable choice, though it doesn't end up mattering as Kayla ends up winning her heat anyway through literally just trying all the combinations and somehow that being faster than just properly doing the challenge, which was kind of lame. And we do end up with the same winners as the last daily, with Brad winning as well, and the noms end up being pretty basic here, with Kendall obviously going in, while we do get a bit more of a showdown on the men's side as Darrell wants to take on Jordan in an attempt to get him out before the final, leading to an interesting elimination, where again, on the women's side, it was a bit unfair due to Beth having a massive size advantage on Kendall, which leads to an abrupt end to her run there, but we do also have this Darrell versus Jordan battle. That was a pretty fun one here, where we see Darrell try to tire Jordan out, which ends up being ineffective, and after almost an hour, we do see Darrell end up tiring out, despite him having the lead, and it's surprisingly causing Darrell to be on the ground completely exhausted and being carried out on a stretcher, which is something I never expected to see from Darrell, which was an interesting outcome to this episode, being the best elimination up to this point. Well, then let's talk about the boots, starting off with Kendall, who again had that really great moment of her blowing up her spot by saboing MJ. She was also underdog throughout a lot of her run here, but again, I do feel like she had a mostly quiet boot episode, but this was a season that to me really solidified Kendall as one, a really indecisive player, but one that is extremely chaotic, and one that I do think makes her really interesting TV, as you're just never going to know what she's going to do. But then we got Darrell, who again also more of the same on this season, with him still having some solid confessionals, but this obviously ends up being his worst run on All Stars, with him coming in second twice in the past, but really he didn't have that much of an impact on this season, with his actual boot here being the majority of his content on this season. And while he is a top tier competitor still for the series, I do feel like we've gotten most of what we're going to get from Darrell. So again, despite the fact that he's likable and he obviously adds to the prestige of the cast, I'm not really sure he's someone that we need to see back moving forward. Now for episode 5, where we do get more of the same storylines, but we do see Wes start to ingrain himself within the majority alliance, with him attempting to take Darrell's role in that alliance, getting them to all agree to target the former winners and Jordan, which really sets the stage for Yes becoming the big target on the board for this episode. But then we do get to the daily, where we find out that the format is changing for the endgame here, where we are getting rid of the last place going into elimination rule, but also minimizing the size of the authority to just the top man and woman, giving less people the power to decide the nominee. But now the nominee gets to pick their opponent in elimination. Again, a similar format to what we've seen in the past, and one that I do really like, as it obviously gives this added layer of social strategy added to the game of the player having to pick their opponent. That gives the underdog a bit more of a chance in taking out a member of the majority alliance. Now the Sabos end up being standard fare, with Kayla using hers on Beth, while Brad uses his on MJ again, to which we get MJ talking about not even trying in the daily to save his energy for elimination, which, considering the fact that he does have an injured knee, I do think it was probably the safer move to make here. Now that last place doesn't automatically go in, and through that he ends up being safe throughout this round anyway, but this ends up being another daily that involved social strategy elements that made it another easy win for the majority, where we do see the men create this plan to throw the competition to Mark, immediately knocking out MJ, Jordan, and Yes, which it is humorous how even they knew about this plan before the plan went through. So I did find it weird how open this plan seemed to be with the rest of the cast. But we do see Brad being annoyed about having to go along with this plan, and is upset with Wes in particular, which plays into the later nomination. But Mark does end up winning here, while on the women's side we do see the Treehouse easily gang up against the others, with Beth going out first, and her being really upset at Janae for helping the Treehouse, which was just kind of dumb. But this is where we get Beth's confessional about Janae being a cheater in many ways, which we will talk about. But Sylvia ends up being handed the win here, and TJ weirdly tells the cast that he's proud of them after this daily, which, why? I mean, most of this cast was throwing the comp, so I don't know why TJ wasn't scolding them as he normally would. So again, I found that really strange, but he ends up being extremely nice to them here. But then we get to the scramble where even at the party, no one ended up actually partying, and instead they did a lot of strategizing, which is kind of fun, with Beth seeming to be the easy target for the women, but there is also worry of who she will pick, until Beth ends up revealing that she is targeting Janae, because she's not an honest person, because Janae is cheating on her husband with MJ. Which, I mean, rumors of this were circulating around the time of filming, and definitely feels like Beth was just using those rumors to her benefit here. And even before the season aired, we already knew that these rumors would play a factor on this season. And I will say I was kind of underwhelmed that they didn't play more of a factor here. I was expecting this to be a lot more explosive than it ends up being here, where all we get is this short confrontation between the two at the party here, and then we obviously have Beth using this as an excuse to quit the game. But again, relatively small bit of the season, but still an interesting bit of drama that was added in here. And obviously this is all still happening while MJ is campaigning against Brad, talking about Brad making the game personal. But this ends up playing a factor into why Brad doesn't want to send MJ into elimination, as obviously he's worried that MJ is going to pick him. So this is where we see Brad go to Wes, upset at the situation, and in a very un-Wes-like move, Wes decides that to prove his friendship to Brad, he's going to throw himself into elimination to keep Brad safe. Which, again, I don't feel like this is the move that Wes would typically do. This does obviously give him a great opportunity to drag Yes down with him, which allows him to be a ham for the camera, which that's obviously what you would expect from Wes. But back on the women's side, we do actually end up getting the reveal that Janae actually asked to be put into elimination so that she can pick Beth herself. So we do get this pretty good matchup between the two. So we do get these two pretty strong matchups coming into the arena. But I did find the actual elimination kind of lame, where I feel like this was the perfect time to have a really physical head-to-head competition. And we kind of get that, but one without any direct contact, where you have to push these pillars to knock the other off a wall. And I just found that largely underwhelming here, though the matchups themselves are pretty strong. Again, the Janae-Beth elimination ends with Beth quitting due to MJ helping Janae from the sidelines, which she deems as unfair. Though I feel like a lot more of the reason why she quits is because she knew she had no shot here and wanted to go out in a more dramatic way. So obviously she succeeds in that goal. Meanwhile, we do get the culmination of the Wes-Yes rivalry, and I do love this moment of TJ calling out Yes for giving a BS answer to how he feels, where Yes says that he is there to nurture the flame of fairness and integrity, which is just such a ridiculous line. But the elimination ends up going on for a while, to the point where, despite this supposedly being this grandiose moment, I did feel like it was kind of boring by the end of it, just due to the fact that it was taking so long and there was so little movement throughout the majority of it, with Wes just staying calm while Yes was actually the one that was doing the smack talking, which again is a bit unexpected. But after a while, we do eventually have Wes pulling it out, which ends up ending what is one of the better episodes of the season, but an episode that, again, I do feel like it was kind of underwhelming considering my expectations of it. But with that, let's talk about the boots, starting off with Beth, who again feels like a return to form in terms of the type of character that she is, where typically she is this like really chaotic figure that brings plenty of drama through her spreading scandalous rumors about the other players, and she brought that energy here after her more boring run in my eyes in All-Stars 1, so I was happy to see that. Though I do wish that Beth would at least try to play the game at some point, but either way, still an entertaining ride here. And then we have Yes, who I still think is a pretty bland character, but still a mostly likable guy, and one that I was happy to see back here due to his legacy now as the winner of All-Stars 1, and him having an impressive win at that. So to see him back here was interesting, though I do feel like this would have been a mostly underwhelming run had he not had this rivalry with Wes, which does end up being one of the more notable storylines of the season. And now let's get to episode 6, which does mostly revolve around this Sylvia-Kellyanne rivalry, with this being a clear setup for Sylvia being the boots, though Kellyanne does get a decent amount of personal content along the way. But funnily, we do see Sylvia openly talk about sabotaging Kellyanne, only for her to change her mind when she sees that the daily involves a puzzle, and instead decides to use it on Janae, because of her assumption that Kellyanne will suck at the puzzle due to the previous elimination, which humorously leads to Kellyanne winning the challenge for the women, and Sylvia ends up making a passive-aggressive move immediately afterwards, which ends up fully putting the target onto her back. On the men's side of things, we do see a lot more of the MJ-Brad rivalry, with MJ once again getting saboed, though this time from Mark, though technically he asks for it this time, and does the same strat as the previous round of not really trying in the daily to avoid injury, but we do end up with Brad winning the daily once again. That did feel like a death sentence for MJ here, with now there not being any worry of MJ pulling Brad in. And afterwards we see Brad and Kellyanne agree to give each other the soul vote of who they put in on their side, which makes it pretty clear that Sylvia and MJ are going in, and it really felt like they were being set up to go home here as well, where they do end up picking Naya and Derek to face off against, who didn't really get that much of a setup to a potential boot over the course of this episode, so I didn't feel like there was much suspense during the elimination. But we do get a fun exit from Sylvia with her talking about how this is personal to Kellyanne on her way out. But with that, let's talk about the boots, starting with Sylvia, who to me was the biggest question mark on why is she on the cast, where at least Kayla is someone that's known for bringing drama, while Sylvia's always been kind of just boring. But I do think she ends up being a somewhat entertaining figure here, largely due to her rivalry with Kellyanne, and she does have a decently impressive run here, winning a few dailies and being a central figure within the Majority Alliance. So again, I was overall pleasantly surprised with what she brought to the show here. And then we have MJ, who I thought had an interesting run here, where coming into All-Stars 2, him and Janae were never targeted and were safe the entire season. And they're obviously transitioning from that to a season where they're two of the biggest targets on the board. And MJ is obviously still injured from last season, though despite that, he still makes a somewhat deep run onto the season. So I did find that pretty fun to watch. And I've always found MJ to be a mostly likable figure across the challenge. And seeing him now be this like massive underdog figure did lead to a fun dynamic here, which also maximized the entertainment that he brought to the show. Now for episode 7, which has the same format as the previous episodes, with Derek and Veronica getting personal content, talking about their significant others, and what do you know, they end up winning the daily. We also do see Janae getting to talk about missing MJ and now feeling alone, which obviously plays into her arc. We also get a visibility spike for Ronnie, who ended up having one of the quieter edits of the season, and here we do see her being on the bottom of the Treehouse Alliance, and we see Kellyanne approach her to make a deal, which she ends up being incommittal to not come off as a sketchy figure within the treehouse. But this style of content made it pretty clear to me that she was poised to go into elimination here. Now we do also get the daily, which ends up being trivia, where the Sabo ends up being an automatic strike against any player, which seemed more like a disadvantage than anything, as this gives the person that you give a strike to an easy person for them to put their strikes on. And through that, we do see Brad end up saboing himself, which obviously on paper seems like a bad move, but without the rule of bottom players going to elimination and Brad being in a decent spot in the game to begin with, and also not being good at trivia to begin with, I do feel like this was actually a pretty savvy move on his end to not create any unnecessary enemies and decreasing the chance he goes into elimination. While for Kellyanne, she was already technically in a bad position. For her, I don't think this would have been as effective of a move, and we do see her using the Sabo on Veronica, who ends up dominating this challenge, which was funny to watch her mocking TJ for thinking that these were hard questions. And also on the men's side of things, we do see the return of the Derek-Nehemiah rivalry from last season, and it did seem like Derek wanted to target Nehemiah off the bat after winning the daily here, but then we see Mark trying to get him to target Jordan, obviously as this massive threat in the final, to which we do see him pull the trigger, despite that it seemed like it was an accepted fact that most people were going to pull in Mark, which never gets properly explained. And I feel like that's one of my bigger complaints with this episode, is I do feel like the proper setup of this like Jordan-Mark rivalry would have been really interesting to see, considering it seemed like it was obvious to everyone that he was going to pull in Mark. But the fact that like we get none of this on the show is a very questionable decision to me. But also we do see Kellyanne do some decent work in making a deal with Veronica that causes Veronica to keep her safe here, and instead put in John A, leading to the arena where the picks do kind of come out of nowhere here, where John A picks Ronnie, where yeah, again, it was obvious that Ronnie was going in due to her spiking content, but John A never talked about pulling Ronnie in, and it's only mentioned after the fact that she picked her as the biggest threat in the final, which again was never mentioned before on the season. But then we also see Jordan talking about taking down the Godfather, and he ends up picking Mark, which again would have been a big moment here, but it just comes off pretty anticlimactic here. And I did feel like the elimination was once again pretty lame here, and it mostly coming down to a puzzle, though it does start with a section where you have to pull a weight up using a rope, which obviously disfavors Jordan having only one hand. And again, we just kind of anticlimactically lose Ronnie and Jordan here, with the Jordan elimination in particular to me feeling like one that should have been this big moment for the season, but instead it just ends up being a whimper. But with that, let's talk about the boots, starting off with Ronnie, who was a cool get for this season, being this undefeated, old school player. But I did feel like she ended up being kind of boring on the return here, where she was just there for most of the season without playing an important role in any of the storylines going on. So while it was cool to see her back for the first time since the Gauntlet, I didn't find her to be the most riveting TV, as she did seem to be a mostly passive player. Next up, we have Jordan, who again had a bit of a redemption arc here in the sense that he didn't come off as a dick across this season, which would be typically the norm for him. So again, it seemed like he matured a bit since the last time he played, but also I do feel like this just ends up being a mostly underwhelming run for him. Now, obviously, he did have this massive target on his back, and he still makes it really far here, but he really didn't bring that much entertainment to the season, and also had a mostly middling performance competition-wise, where I was just kind of underwhelmed with his appearance here. Now for episode 8, which starts with the blatant foreshadowing of showcasing Mark and Derek's relationship, with Derek saying that they have all the momentum going their way, which made it very clear something was going to go wrong here. Afterwards, at the start of the daily, we do hear about Veronica having fallen down the stairs, which was briefly mentioned in the previously on, but here we do find out that she has broken a toe, and it turns out that she has to be DQ'd, which was very abrupt. Though you get this pretty lengthy farewell to her, with her seeming to be annoyed about her DQ for something so minor, and even TJ feels bad about doing so, and I do feel like the DQ as a whole here did feel kind of ridiculous. I mean, I get the liability issues for production and letting her continue to play in the case that she injures it even more, but it does feel like this is a mostly minor injury that they could have let her continue on with. I mean, we've seen more major injuries continue on the show in the past, and even something like Survivor in Heroes vs. Villains, we saw Rupert play 36 days with a broken toe. So I did find this overall to be a very bizarre DQ here, but she ends up having to leave. And really the daily itself ends up being kind of boring to me, but it does lead to a lot of personal content for Naya. And really a lot of this episode revolves around Naya in a situation where she doesn't go into elimination. So that was a bit of a pleasant surprise from All Stars here, but we do see her being sad at losing Jordan and see a lot of her insecurities, talking about how she doesn't have a why for being there anymore and lacks the confidence that she needs. And we end up seeing her quit the daily, but along with this comes some pretty nice scenes of Nehemiah and John A. and Brad trying to help her, and Nehemiah in particular gets a lot of focus here in helping her, which all this was a really nice way to see this more vulnerable side of Naya, someone who had been really hardened through her previous challenge runs. And really just shows you how much she has changed since her original run. But through this, the authority ends up being Mark and Janae in a bizarre situation where almost everyone wants to go in, largely because the final is nearing, and TJ continues to put a lot of emphasis on the importance of stars, where we do see Derek becoming the target on the men's side due to having the most amount of stars, and both Wes and Nehemiah talk about taking him on. Wes in particular talks about throwing himself in, during which we get this really weird scene of him talking about needing to make a call for advice, and it ends up being this really scripted scene of him talking to Bananas that felt so forced here, and really leads to nothing as the authority ends up actively not picking him to spite him, and instead pick Derek, as Derek obviously knows that he's going in, and this will obviously allow him to pick his opponent. While on the women's side, again, everyone volunteers there, though we do see Kayla being picked and picking Kellyanne. But really none of this matters, as they're clearly going to cancel the elimination due to Veronica's DQ anyway. But we do see that the elimination is pole wrestle, and for Derek, he does have two pretty great choices here. He has Wes, the person that beat him in pole wrestle in that really iconic elimination from the duel, and we could get a rematch of that. Or he could pick Nehemiah, his rival over the course of the previous All-Star seasons, and that is the route that he ends up choosing, openly stating that this was the easier option for him, which is probably not a good look for him in retrospect. But bizarrely, we do get a cliffhanger here in the middle of the elimination that did come out of nowhere to me, where it just felt like such a jarring spot to put it, that really just saps all of the momentum of this elimination. Though obviously at the beginning of the next episode, we do see that Derek ends up being eliminated. And with that, let's talk about the boots here. Starting off with Veronica, who again, I really felt for, considering her boot felt very abrupt here. I mean, she did have a pretty strong run across the season, being in the majority alliance for most of the season. And while the alliance crumbled around her to where after she leaves, it's really only Kayla left, she was still a pretty focal piece within that alliance. And really, she had a better run than I could have ever expected for her coming into the season, where, again, she does seem a bit past her prime. But I do feel like this season went, again, as well as it could have for her, and I was sad to see it end due to a pretty dumb injury here. And then we got Derek, who, I mean, was fine. I mean, he gets the same style content as you would expect for him. He's really just the same character over and over again, but he didn't have nearly as explosive of a run as he did in the last season, but he still continues to be a solid competitor, and I feel like him losing to Nehemiah here felt like one of the better case scenarios for his downfall on this season, considering their rivalry and it feeling a payoff to that. Now for episode 9, which starts by finishing the Nehemiah-Derek elimination, which ends up being extremely anticlimactic here. But then we get the weird fake out that they do for the women, where they even set them up to start the pole wrestle, only for TJ to call it off at the last second, and even the players themselves were disappointed by this revelation, and all this was just a really awkward way to start the episode. But we do follow this up with another fake out, where we get the reveal that everyone will be participating in an immediate challenge with no details on the ramifications of this challenge. The challenge itself ends up being another kind of lame one that felt like when you would see on Big Brother, of them having to answer questions based on photos that were at the house, which again doesn't feel very challengey. But at the end of the day, the challenge ends up deciding the order that the players get to leave during the final, and also determines their partners, which essentially this order does end up pretty much deciding the finish order for the first checkpoint, as there really wasn't much time for the players to make up or lose any true time there. Though along the way, we do also get some drama from Nia getting upset at Kayla for looking at her board, which starts their rivalry, which is bizarre considering it's at the very tail end of the season. And afterwards, we do get our final scenes before the final, where we do see an argument between Nia and Kayla, where Kayla continues to lie about her not having looked at her board, while Nia talks about how she's upset that Kayla would do something like that, which really, I don't get why she's so upset here. I mean, to me, this is fair game. I mean, Nia could have done the same thing back, and even then, Nia didn't seem to be doing that well herself, where she ends up coming in last anyway. So I personally don't feel like this is that big of a deal. Though I did like how Nia ended up holding back during this argument here, which, while it does minimize how good of TV this moment could have been, it does also show you the growth Nia has gone through since her last season, where obviously she was going overboard during fights and eventually led to her DQ. Now also along the way, we do get solid content from really the entire cast leading up to the final, though it did seem like Wes and Janae got more of a highlight here, and considering their edits across the season, it did make it pretty clear they were the winners from an edit perspective at this point. But then the players are flown out to a private island to start the final, which was in a similar format to that of All Stars 1, where there are multiple checkpoints where you are paired up, and you get points based on where you place. But in addition to that is also that we have these 1v1 face-offs at these checkpoints, where the winners of these face-offs get 5 points, making these way more important in boosting your overall total. And overall, I did find this to be a decent format. I mean, I really like the format of All Stars 1 to begin with, and this little change here does very little to deter my original opinion of that. But then we do learn the importance of the stars, where TJ announces that these stars only matter to those that have the highest amount, and the people that have the highest amount in Nehemiah and Janae get 5 points to start, and that's it. Which, again, very anticlimactic considering how much the stars were hyped up. And really just makes the talk about them from earlier on just sound kind of ridiculous at this point. Then we get to the final, where Wes really takes an early lead on the men's side, getting first in each of his legs, while on the women's side we do see a closer race between Janae and Naya, with Kayla end up underperforming in the mental sections, while Janae and Naya obviously excelling in those. Though, as expected, we do end the episode midway through the final, as obviously they were going to milk another episode out of this, and also, obviously the final started at around the halfway point in the episode, so again, just kind of an awkward transition into the next episode here, where we do jump into the finale, which continues this pretty baseline final, though along the way we do get a checkpoint that was a redo of King of the Hill, the first challenge from Gauntlet 2, and the first challenge that TJ ever hosted. I did feel like that was a pretty cool callback there. Now we do get the overnight portion that ends up being pretty bizarre, as they decide to not punish them, and instead they get to spend their time on a yacht. And through this we essentially get a redo of the scenes that we got from the previous episode, of them once again setting up the stakes and why they want to win, and really all that was kind of boring. But then we get to the start of day 2, which was an instant elimination between the two with the lowest points. And really this ends up being underwhelming to me as well. First with the fact that the challenge ends up being a crossword puzzle, but even beyond that, this sequence just felt very rushed, with Brad beating Mark and Kayla beating Kellyanne, with the latter of which being even stranger considering how much their rivalry had been hyped up throughout the season. That really made Kellyanne's elimination here end up being underwhelming from a storyline aspect. But then we get to the final individual portion of the final, where we find out that the points don't matter anymore, really only mattering for that final elimination, which also ends up being underwhelming here, essentially meaning that most of what we had just seen doesn't matter. And while it doesn't seem like it made a difference in the final winners, as the top 2 point getters end up winning anyway, I do think this would have been underwhelming if someone went from last to winning this final leg, a final leg that comprised of mostly mediocre tasks, where we go from gross food eating to a basic puzzle to domino stacking and finally a paddle to the yacht, which acted as the finish line. Again, an underwhelming final leg of the final here that again had an interesting format before that. But we do get a satisfying conclusion to the season though, with Wes and Janae obviously end up winning, who seem like clear winners here, with their storylines being the most fleshed out, and their wins here definitely do add to their legacy. Though again, I do feel like this scene came off as pretty rushed to me, where I was genuinely surprised when the episode just kind of abruptly ends. But again, I just feel like there are pros and cons with this finale. I like the results. I thought the original final format was strong, but really it just ends up being middling just like the rest of the season. But with that, let's wrap up the review by talking about the finalists, starting off with Kellyanne, who I was happy to see her become a bit more of a major character on this season after her being nearly purple in the original All-Stars. And I've always loved Kellyanne, her original run, though she hasn't been as entertaining on recent seasons, but this ends up being one of her better recent seasons, largely due to the fact of her having this rivalry with Kayla. Next up, we have Mark, who's pretty much the same on every season he's ever been on. I mean, he's a very palatable person, strong competitor, but also never been the most riveting TV to me. Comes off as a bit of a ham, but does have a decent role on this season. And I wouldn't be opposed to seeing him be this mainstay on All Stars moving forward, considering his legacy on the show, but I really don't have much faith in him winning, despite the fact that he always makes a deep run. Next up, we have Naya, who I was pleasantly surprised to see how much she has changed and matured in the years since her last appearance. I did like seeing her vulnerable side, and I did like her relationship with Nehemiah, where even in the final here, we see him propping her up as she talks about wanting to quit. And while it would have been more satisfying if Naya ended up winning this season, I did like seeing this development for her here, and I do think this season opens it up for us seeing her again moving forward. Next up, we have Nehemiah, who really didn't seem to have much to do on this season, which is bizarre considering he was obviously the main character of the previous season. But with him now being in the majority for most of the season, and Wes clearly getting more of the screen time for the duo, he just ends up being there. Again, I did like his relationship with Nia, but outside that, didn't bring much to the show. Next up, we have Kayla, who really brought more of the same, but did end up being an entertaining figure here. She had numerous rivalries throughout the season, and has become one of the more integral figures within the political game throughout this season, with her being part of the core of the Treehouse Alliance. I do think physically she ends up kind of underwhelming me here, where she had always been a slightly above average competitor in the main show, and coming into this, you would have expected her to be a top tier challenger. And while she does end up coming in second here, I didn't find this to be that overly impressive of a run for her, based on what you would expect from her, considering the fact that she is the youngest person on this cast and the person on the women's side of things that is least removed from the main show. Next up, we have Brad, who also was more of the same, a mostly likable guy, a guy that tries to play with honor, but also one that is probably not the most riveting TV, though is also one of the most notable figures in challenge history, and him being here definitely adds to the legacy of this season. And this was a pretty good run for him. I mean, he won a bunch of dailies, he just came short of winning here, but again, entertainment-wise, he's pretty baseline for me. And finally, let's talk about the winners, starting with Janae, who I was very happy to see her get a second win in a row here. Would have potentially been a third had All-Stars 1 had a female winner, and she is now the top female competitor on each of the All-Star seasons, which is an insanely impressive stat. And this is probably her most impressive season of the three, with her having her back against the wall due to the target that was on her back for winning the previous season, and still being able to navigate the game politically pretty well here. And even when she had to perform, she did pretty well. So again, I think this is a very solid win, and one that does radically change her legacy. They're now possibly in the conversation of being one of the top female competitors of all time. And then we have Wes, who had a nice return to form here after some underwhelming seasons on the main show, and he's another one that, despite the target on his back early on in the game, with like two of the strongest players in the house directly coming for him, he was somehow able to avoid all that and had a pretty solid run here, being in the lead throughout most of the final. Now again, I do think this was a more toned down final in comparison to what you would see on the main show, to where I don't know if it's necessarily means that he's back in his prime or anything like that. I think in reality, he's just the same Wes that we saw in the last few seasons. It's just that his skill set is better suited to All-Stars. And to be honest, the same thing goes for Janae as well, where again, All-Stars has become less physically demanding than the main show, but also incorporates a lot more puzzles. So it really benefits these people that are mentally strong and don't really need to be at the top of physical shape to win a final here. You really just need to be physical enough. I feel like those styles of competitions are what Wes excels in. So again, for me, he's the perfect type of competitor to transition to All-Stars here, and it was nice to see him have a good run here despite a rocky starting point and him getting this villainous arc to begin with. But there we go. I mean, that's the season of the Challenge All-Stars 3, which to me ends up being a very middle of the road season, which is disappointing considering I expected this season to be an all-time great one with an all-time great cast. But to me, it really just came off as average, mostly on par of All-Stars 2, probably slightly worse in my eyes, as I felt like the dynamics in that season were a lot more interesting to me. It really didn't reach the level of quality I wanted it to, though we do still get some interesting storylines and rivalries, but I really just felt very meh throughout a lot of the season, and through that found it kind of underwhelming. But that's my review of the Challenge All-Stars 3. Now moving forward, we obviously have a lot of other shows going on. BBAU is also concluding. We have BB24 and a Challenge USA that had just started. We have Survivor South Africa starting soon. So my coverage of those shows will be coming down the road. Also, I do expect to cover the Challenge 38 whenever that ends up airing. I would like to do more random challenge videos moving forward, though realistically, I don't know how soon I can squeeze those videos into the schedule, but I would like to do some more rankings and casting videos for the challenge at some point down the road. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.